What a great idea.
Well, I want to welcome you all this afternoon. Thanks for braving the elements. I know this is yet another major Washington snowstorm, so appreciate you coming out. And I gather we have a number of people watching on the live stream who were not as brave, but we're delighted that they could join us for the conversation. Also, for those on the live stream, as well as for those here, if you want to use the hashtag Dean's Discussion, you can post your questions online, and we'll have somebody following that, the Twitter feed, which is appropriate because I will introduce Anne-Marie in a moment, but she is the one who first encouraged me to get on Twitter, and I immediately signed up and got an account, and then did not tweet anything for the next 2 years. But I credit her with making sure I got on there. But I do tweet now, so if you want to follow at Jim Goldgeier, please feel free to do so. Everybody already follows her, so I don't need to give out her handle. Anne-Marie Slaughter is the president and CEO of the New America Foundation and the Bert G. Kerstetter 66 University Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton. From 2009 to 2011, she was Director of Policy Planning for the United States Department of State, and she was the first woman to hold that position. Prior to her service at the State Department, she was Dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and before that, J. Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International Foreign and Comparative Law at Harvard Law School. She's written or edited 6 books, including A New World Order and The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World, is a frequent contributor to a number of publications, including The Atlantic and Project Syndicate. In 2012, she published Why Women Still Can't Have It All in The Atlantic, which quickly became the most read article in the history of the magazine and helped spark a major national debate on continued obstacles to genuine, full male-female equality. We also happen to be good friends with her husband and political scientist Danny Moravchik, with whom I work every year at Syracuse every June in the Institute for Qualitative and Multi-Method Research. And she has 2 boys at home who are 17 and 15. The title of this, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
We're just thrilled to have you here. Anne-Marie's probably the last person I spoke to before I took this job. I called her, and because she had been such a successful dean at Princeton, I called her and said, so what do you think? And she was very encouraging, so here I am. So I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful
and
to her for that.
And obviously you're flourishing. So
thank you. So the title of this event is Revaluing Care at Home and Abroad, which came from you. So the first question is, what do you mean by revaluing care at home and abroad?
Great. So first of all, it is great to be here. And that title comes from the evolution of my thinking since I wrote the Atlantic article. And I have to say, in this audience, with you as a foreign policy IR scholar colleague and a number of my former colleagues in the audience, as you noted, I've written quite a few articles, really over a long academic career. And now pretty much wherever I go, I'll be talking about Syria or Ukraine or something in the world, and then someone will raise their hand and say, could I ask you about the article? So as if there's only one. But since I wrote that article, I wrote that article starting in the same place Sheryl Sandberg starts with Lean In, with, after 50 years of the women's movement, the second wave of the women's movement, we're still stuck at this number that in some professions is 5% women at the top and others is 15% women at the top, but never gets anything close to 50%, and is radically different than the numbers of girls coming out of high school, young women going into college, coming out of college. So you have these total equality. If anything, women are ahead of the game when they come out of college and go into the workforce. They have children and everything changes. So I started really from the proposition that the problem was still discrimination against women. And I don't want to stand here for a minute and say there isn't still discrimination against women. There is, and particularly lower income women. I just finished reading Lily Ledbetter's Grace and Grit, and if you have any doubts, it puts those to rest. But I have come to believe that the deeper problem The problem that unites many facets of the symptoms we see is less about women per se and more about not valuing the work that women have traditionally done, which is to say we value competition, we value consumption, we don't value care. And when you start seeing it that way, and I think of it even in my lifetime, as we used to call it women's lib, right? As a woman who wanted a career in the 1970s, it was always you want to do the work Dad did. The work Mom did was to be basically, that was devalued. That is not what you wanted to do. And I think the pendulum's really swung way too far. I mean, that made sense because women wanted opportunities and choices and power, and that was in a world shaped by men. But in fact, I start from a quote from Bill Gates at Davos where he says, there are two great forces in human nature, competition or self-interest and caring for others. And if you really think those are equal, just try it on as a thought experiment. If you really think those are equal, that it is as important for you to take care of your children, your parents, your siblings, your friends, anybody you love, it is just as important for you to care for those people in the scheme of human values as it is to earn an income. Lots of things change. And then you start to see, well, wait a minute, the same reason there are not enough women at the top, which is because women take time out, more likely to take time out for caregiving and then get penalized when they try to get back in, that's the same reason we have too many women at the bottom. Because at the bottom, women are caregivers and breadwinners, right? Single moms have to do both, and we give them very little support. We expect them to work, but we do not support their caregiving in any way, whether it's daycare, easy medical care, good schools, any of that. So I'm really writing a book about what it would look like if we really treated men and women equally, the work that men and women have traditionally done equally. That would lead us to value it when men do it as well as when women do it, which is very important. And then, because it was you and it was this talk, I think it's an interesting thought experiment to ask what that would mean if we put that abroad.
And can we add that then? Let's move to the sort of discussion about this kind of thinking with respect to foreign policy. One of the signature things that Secretary Clinton did that you were the leading force for within the State Department was doing a development diplomacy review.
Right.
That was meant to be a complement to the quadrennial defense review that takes place in the Pentagon, and really to raise these types of issues to an equal place.
Exactly.
With what the Pentagon does with respect to the defense review. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges in trying to flesh that out within a State Department, and also whether or not the kinds of issues that you were working on for Secretary Clinton, have those continued to be valued in a State Department now that she's no longer the Secretary?
So yes, and the first thing to say is, the goal of the QDDR, the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, was to have a review like the Defense Department does. I mean, Secretary Clinton was a very good politician there. She had sat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and she'd seen DOD come in and make a case for their budget consistent with their 4-year plan, right? And she knew that carried more weight than a budget unsupported by a larger plan. So partly she was just saying, A, we need a strategic planning process, B, this is smart politics, and C, I want to do something that elevates development to make it equal with diplomacy. I mean, that's the thing that really was most important to me working for her for those 2 years, and she changed my own thinking, because I went in thinking, foreign policy is national security, global governance, development is over here, it's this other thing that people do. And I came out thinking, no, development, thinking about, and this goes back to care, right? Thinking about the entire infrastructure of taking care of people from, maternal mortality to child development, to education, to health, to opportunity for youth, is every bit as important as the strategic chess game that we have been taught is the heart of foreign policy. So, the QDDR was designed to try to institutionalize that. It was a crash course in bureaucratic politics. I was often asked, okay, you've been a professor, what's the biggest difference between, being in the university and being in Washington? And I would say, well, in Washington, in academia, you're rewarded for big ideas with your name on them, preferably only your name on them. You want somebody to think, Anne Marie Slaughter networks. She invented networks. That's completely not true, but that's sort of what you want. And in Washington, you want to take big ideas and chop them into little ideas. Nothing makes a group of bureaucrats more worried than you're coming in and saying, oh, I've got a big idea, let's overhaul X. No, you want to chop it into little ideas and then convince other people they thought of them. Because you also never want to take credit. So the QDDR was a crash course in that, but what we were really trying to do is to not just policies, but build in the institutional structures, the incentives, everything from how foreign service officers are recruited to how they're evaluated, to institutionalize it. Today, they're about to launch a second QDDR. Tom Perriello is in charge of the second QDDR. This really did make me laugh. He's from Charlottesville, Virginia, and the same high school I am. So why it is that this one high school in Charlottesville, Virginia has produced the two first directors of the QDDR, but he's in place. Yeah, I've talked to him several times. He's getting going. So there's no question that the institution's going to continue. I think, again, it's the QDDR, and it's state and aid, and that's important. I do think, though, that Secretary Kerry recognizes the value of these issues. I'm not sure he feels them in his gut the same way Secretary Clinton did. And he's also been handed a classic geopolitical agenda, right? He's even the way Syria prompted out the negotiations with Iran, now Ukraine. This is a pretty classic foreign policy playbook, whereas she was actually having to focus much more on a lot of these broader issues. But I'm glad we institutionalized it, because I think you have to feel it.
So I'm going to come back to issues like Syria and Ukraine in a moment, but I wanted to ask you, just in terms of following on this, now you're in a very different role. You're head of the New America Foundation. Curious your thoughts on how that compares to either being in the government or being at a university. It is very different. And how does that provide a platform to push forward these issues differently than you would be able to if you were either in government or at a university?
Well, the short answer is it's like cutting loose from the mothership, right? I feel like in Star Trek, I'm out there in a much smaller vehicle. I never completely appreciated, when you're an academic and the university is your base and your home, and people ask you what you do and you can say you're a professor and they basically know what that means. If you tell people you're the head of a think tank, only inside the Beltway does that mean much of anything. So that's been challenging. What's neat about it is that we're not a usual think tank. I mean, we are about big ideas. We're about technology. We have a tech lab upstairs. I've got 10 people who write code and a whole other group of people who deploy code in communities, helping people with new technology and digital literacy, and then people who do technology policy. And we're very focused on getting beyond the Beltway. So what makes it exciting is particularly at this time in America, there are big problems. And we're really trying to harness the intellectual talent and tie it to technology and then tie it to communications in a way that is a platform for getting solutions out to those problems. And that's, in some ways, it's the very most fun part of academia, in the sense of that early part when the ideas are big and shining and you get all excited, and less of the really long, hard slog where you have to turn them into operational pros. Coming back to the foreign policy issues for a minute, one of the things you are known for from your time in academia and then beyond is pushing forward the notion of a responsibility to protect. And we saw how that has been used, really came to fruition in Kosovo in 1999, then again in Libya
in 2011. You've been very passionate about the need to do more on Syria, and would like to hear sort of your thinking now. I know that you had been writing at the time that the Geneva negotiations were starting up again in January about the things you thought needed to be done to try to push a process forward, and would like to get your take on that. But also, President Putin has essentially used his version of the responsibility to protect to go into Crimea and to talk about Russians in other parts of the former Soviet Union. I think some people feel, in a sense, because of Syria, that the responsibility to protect as a notion is in some sense in retreat. And just sort of as you look back on the effort to really develop a UN international community support for this notion, where you see this right now, and what you think we have to do to keep this notion moving forward.
Well, the first thing to say is, I started actually before any of this as an international lawyer, and that's really my training. And so in international law terms, the responsibility to protect has been a wild success in the sense that it was an academic concept in the late 1990s. Francis Deng really did the work that led to it. Then you had a commission, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, with Gareth Evans and Mohammed Sanoun. They turn it into a more actionable concept. Then it gets adopted by the Millennium Summit in 2005. And then it's actually applied in 2011. So from the point, if you think about, by comparison, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is 1949, and you don't even get treaties until 20 years later, and then it takes decades and decades. I mean, in 1976, when Jimmy Carter said human rights should be part of our foreign policy, he was laughed out of town, which seems incredible now. So that's how long it took. So that's the first thing to say. I'm actually very optimistic. I do think that Libya, I don't believe for a minute when the Russians say, oh, we didn't know that you were going to actually have to bomb in Libya. That's ridiculous. Susan Rice can give you chapter and verse exactly what she told the Russians. On the other hand, it did turn into NATO pursuing the Gaddafi government, and NATO did not take enough care to protect Libyans from the opposition forces, right? If our goal was to protect individuals, it definitely became much too one-sided. So, then you have countries like Brazil and India saying, wait a minute, what about the responsibility while protecting? We don't want to be part of something that is effectively on one side. Now, the counter-argument was, well, but until you get Gaddafi out, you're not going to protect Libyans. I understand that, but I think the execution had its problems. I don't think, though, yes, it made it harder in Syria, but honestly, if President Obama had ever wanted today to do something in Syria, he could have done so. It's not the responsibility to protect that is stopping action. It's the lack of desire to actually take the risks that action would involve. And from Putin's point of view, fine, he can't have it both ways. If he wants to invoke it in Crimea, fine, then I'm ready to invoke it again in Syria. Ultimately, I think the way to see this is governments massacring their own people will more and more and more be the kinds of conflicts, as they have been since the end of the Cold War, where horrible things happen, humanitarian crises, strategic crises, and we're going to have to figure out how to act. And the responsibility to protect thus far is the only legal framework that allows us to do that. And it's really a change in the definition of sovereignty itself. It's really saying you are not fully sovereign if you are committing genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or ethnic cleansing against your people. And that's a revolution. Might take a century to get all the way there, but it seems to me it's where we have to go.
Well, even though these are called Dean's Discussion, we probably should actually change the name to Dean Starts the Discussion, because they aren't all about the dean asking questions. So I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time for folks either who are here or watching the live stream to ask questions. We have a microphone. If you can identify yourself and ask a question and make it a brief question, then we'll have lots of time for the conversation. So who would like to get us started? Yep, please. There's the mic right there.
Hi, my name's Rob Lord, and I'm a master's student here at SIS studying peace and conflict resolution. And my question is, you just mentioned a comparison between the invocation of the responsibility to protect in Ukraine and the potential for the responsibility to protect to be invoked with regard to Syria. Do you see a qualitative difference between those two forms of invocation, or are they roughly comparable?
So I don't think I don't think Crimea meets the criteria that I just laid out. There's no evidence that the government was committing genocide, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, or grave war crimes against Russians in Crimea. There was some violence, there may well have been threats, but that does, the responsibility to protect is not licensed to intervene whenever, something bad happens to citizens. It's a high bar, and it should be a high bar. So from that point of view, no, Putin does not have any legal basis to do what he did. I'm just saying that if even rhetorically he wants to invoke that, we can use that against him later when you're arguing for a situation where you do need to use it. Syria is absolutely such a situation. I am absolutely convinced that Syria is the Rwanda of our time. I mean, in terms of the scale of death and destruction, we have quotes that 150,000 people were killed. That's a huge number of people right there, but I don't think that nearly gets at what we're going to find once we're actually allowed in. Remember, foreign journalists have not been, in Syria, and domestic efforts to chronicle what's been happening have been very suppressed. But equally, we're still living with the consequences of Rwanda. Right? Rwanda didn't end in 1994. The war in the Great Lakes in Africa has killed more people than any other conflict currently, and it's been raging, because what happened in Rwanda destabilized the region, right? The Hutus went into Congo, and that has festered ever since, and nobody's been able to fix it. You're looking right now at a horrific human situation that does trigger responsibility to protect without any question, but that is also destabilizing Lebanon, Jordan, parts of Turkey, and Iraq. And that's without even getting to the al-Qaeda dimensions. So, it seems to me we should have acted the minute it was clear he was not going to be deterred. He was going to use whatever violence he could to shut down the opposition, and I called for action in February of 2012. At every turn, it looks awful, and how are we going to do it, and look at all the risks, but a year from now, it will look even worse. So I don't think they're parallel at all, but I don't mind using it against Putin.
On Syria, are you surprised that he's still allowed to operate from the air and bomb from the air?
Yes.
Because that really is at low cost, we could have eliminated that capacity.
Yes, I honestly feel almost responsible as an American that we could stop this, right? We could take out his fixed-wing aircraft. We'd have to also try to take out a lot of his helicopters because he's dropping these bombs from helicopters. But, he gassed children with chemical weapons. That was awful. The administration, showed pictures of kids and how terrible. And chemical weapons, obviously, do have the potential to kill 20,000 at a shot. So I understand that that's a difference category. But, what we're seeing now from the point of view of Syrian civilians is every bit as terrible. And yes, we could stop it. And I think, from my point of view, I wish the president had used force after the chemical weapons. I would have liked to see at least one strike to make very clear to the Syrian government, we're serious, right? We are not scared to use force. And the president's willing to lead against the public opinion of the American people. I think that would have changed the balance. But barring that, I would say now, with the Arab League, you need the approval at least of a regional body, or probably the General Assembly. I would stop him from doing what he's doing.
Yes, Jessica, could we wait for the mic?
Hello, Hello, my name is Jessica Trisco-Darden. I'm a faculty fellow here at SIS, and I'm currently on maternity leave, caring for my 4-month-old son.
Lovely.
I'd like to hear you return
Who
to
hasn't
the...
visited recently, so.
Yeah, but he has, just not very publicly. But I'd like to hear you return to this subject. But my question for you is that you've actually been quite active on Twitter and in other fora trying to raise the profile of women in foreign policy
Yes.
by linking up with Foreign Policy Interrupted,
Yes.
also with hashtag Where Are the Women. I'd like you to speak to whether you think these efforts are really raising the profile of female scholars, particularly young female scholars within the realm of foreign affairs.
Well, I think we need more than Twitter campaigns. I think Foreign Policy Interrupted is great because every time I get a good article, I send it to the bookers at CNN and say, here's somebody you can call, right? And that, just having a pool of real talent, even though, it's always tricky to separate out by gender. It always makes many of us uncomfortable, but given that the claim is constantly, oh, we can't find anybody, it's very helpful to be able to point to that. I think in the academy, we need a much more sustained effort. I mean, you've probably seen Barbara Walters' work and co-authors where, women are simply cited less, and they're cited for smaller propositions. I mean, that's the kind of deep unconscious bias, because I know many of those men, right? I'm not sure one of them I'm married to. I've never looked at Andy's citations. I think I'll not go there. But, it's clearly not conscious. And so what you need to do there is a whole nother round of consciousness raising in the academy. But also, I think you still do just need more women in senior professorial positions, and I know the dean probably agrees with me. I think there's such a tendency to think we're done. That now opportunities are equal and it will work itself out without further agitation or consciousness raising, and I don't think that's true. So what I do on Twitter is because I can do it easily and I do my best. I don't think that's going to have, if I were still in the academy, I would say, no, that's not enough, but it's a start.
I think, the recent story in Foreign Policy where they brought a number of us together, where they had the picture of the 8 white guys, or however many of us there were. And, we're standing there while they're taking the picture. And I wasn't the only one thinking, this is going to look so bad. Like, why did you invite just this group? And, Cecilia Rouse was on phone, so she wasn't, but even so, there were, in fact, I think when I tweeted out, I mentioned the other great women deans who are out there that they could have invited, and I don't think Foreign Policy did it on purpose, but they really gave a platform for people to start talking about these issues all over again, because it was just
well, and their
a picture's worth 1,000 words, and that one was definitely worth at least 1,000.
Right. Well, but the list of columnists, right? Rosa Brooks is the only woman. Now, to be fair to them, I've been asked multiple times, right? If I could certainly write a column. This is part of the pool issue, right? That the women who are in the pool are way overburdened, right? And they've got more invitations than they know what to do with. And many of us are also still, being not full-time, but caregivers. And so there's, part of it is you just need to constantly expand the pool. And that's where I think FP Interrupted is great.
Yes, Rachel. And then was there somebody back there? I can't see. Oh, there.
Hi, is this on?
Yep.
I'm Rachel Robinson. I'm also a faculty member here in SIS. And I wanted to come back to this issue of leadership, primarily because it features so prominently in Sheryl Sandberg's book. But as I read her book, I kept trying to translate to the academic setting. And of course, as both of you will probably attest, there's nothing like being in leadership to take a hit on your scholarship. And so I wanted to know your thoughts on sort of, the issue of being a scholar and being a productive one and producing things that people can cite versus what you can do as a scholar.
It's a great question. So leaning in the academy means saying no. Leaning in the academy means saying, no, I will not chair that committee. My scholarship's too important. No, I will not be available at all hours for students because I'm a woman and expected to be, because my scholarship is too important. It means being selfish, more so, at least early on. The dean is now thinking, why did I ever invite this woman here?
Well, no, I will just say that in the year that she came up for tenure, I told her before that year, I said to her, you must be selfish, because
Right.
she is one of the most unselfish people we have here, and I was like, enough of that.
Enough, exactly,
Be-
exactly.
this is all
There
about
go.
you right now.
It's all-
Okay.
and that's exactly right? It's really, and it's against the weight of expectation, because there really is sort of, people don't expect you to say no, and you pay more of a price than if you're a guy and you say no. But frankly, it's the last thing you want to do is lean in at the table. You want to, shut your door and write that big book or write that big article, and that's, women are not socialized to do that. But I think so it does not translate in the sense of in the corporate world wanting to be present, really to be, as I said, what's rewarded in academia are big ideas and a body of scholarship, and for that you need quiet time and the ability to really give yourself that time.
Her book was just accepted by Cambridge, by the way. So. But I want to follow up on this, because we've had a lot of discussions here at the university. We had an all-faculty retreat, I guess it was the fall of 2012, where issues came up regarding the service trap, especially associate professor women. I think what emerged from the conversation was that women in the university setting, they tend to be more community-oriented. They're more willing to say yes. The guys have no trouble saying no. They don't feel badly about it. I mean, even if the women do say no, even if you tell them to say no, they still feel guilty about it. Often, as dean, you find, you're thinking, well, who can I get who will be really good at this service? And, I mean, it really is a problem in the academy, because, as you're saying, we really do want our women faculty to be as successful as possible, to move up through the ranks from assistant to associate to full. There are a lot of challenges associated with that, both outside the university as well as inside the university. And just your perspective on that, having been hugely successful, but also having been a dean and worked with a faculty at a university.
That's a tough one. But it's true. I remember a colleague of mine at Princeton, who shall remain nameless, telling me that he deliberately did a terrible job chairing the first committee he was asked to chair, so no one would ever ask him to do it again, right? Which is just not something I could ever imagine. But his view was, that's not why I'm in a university. I'm in a university to write and teach and think, and I don't want to chair. And I think it's certainly right that for whatever reason, I mean, I know I feel guiltier about saying no, and it's still hard for me to say no, but, you have to steel yourself every time. I mean, the ideal answer would be the answer I gave at the outset, which would be to say, look, the solitary great scholar is a particular vision of university. It is a much more male vision, although it's hardly true of every man, but it's a kind of great man, that's the way we even talk about it. And that really, for one thing, that's not how the best scholarship is going to be done going forward. It's much more likely to be done in teams, particularly where you need large data and lots of different kinds of expertise. So to begin with, that's not something we should encourage. But more generally, actually, that community activity that many women do engage in is every bit as important as writing that book. That's the answer I'd like to give. I'm not naive enough to give it, right? Because, we are in a university. In the end, big ideas and scholarship is always going to be valued more. So I think you can write that balance a little bit. I definitely think you can sanction men for not participating. You can say, look, there is a minimum of community service and everybody has to do it, but you can't make them do it well. And so, I mean, right. So if they, so it is, so I think you tell the women to say no and tell the men to say yes a little more, right. And do the best you can.
We'll try. Leela had one, and then I don't know if we have anything. If we have anything on the stream, on the feed. Okay.
Hi, my name is Leela Harper, and I'm a second-year U.S. Foreign Policy student here at American University. And my question has to do, as former director of the policy planning for the State Department, I'm very interested in your opinion going forward for U.S. foreign policy in Egypt, specifically within the context of responsibility to protect and governments massacring their people. And I'm wondering at what point should the U.S. step in, and at what point do our strategic interests take a higher seat? As you may have heard, I think it was yesterday, 529 Muslim Brotherhood members were sentenced to death, and we have upwards of 16,000 journalists having been jailed in the recent months. And I'm wondering, when do we step in? What is our role? How do we balance, kind of taking a backseat and not getting too involved, and also standing up for our values?
Wow. So I guess the first answer, I don't think responsibility to protect applies. And again, the danger with responsibility to protect was always that if you defined it too broadly, it was doomed. So I remember in the cyclone, I can't remember the name of the cyclone, but in Myanmar, and where the Myanmar government wasn't providing aid to various areas, and there was evidence that that was ethnically motivated, and people wanted to invoke responsibility to protect. And I was like, no, 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 no. We do not want it to become a blanket justification for intervention whenever a government mistreats its people. And I would say that as horrible as what's happening in Egypt is, it does not rise to the level of responsibility to protect, or if it did, a very large number of governments would be in the same place. I do think, though, this goes back to, so how do we think about our strategic interests? My starting point is that rather than thinking about national security interests and humanitarian interests, we should be thinking about human interests and government interests. And that the human interests, like what happens to people in a country, is every bit as important to us strategically as the amount of power a government has, or the resources, or the size of the economy, all the calculations that usually go into whether or not we care about a state. And the reason being that, I believe that what happens to people within the state will determine what that government does for decades to come. When you look at countries that have huge youth bulges and unemployment and don't take care of their people, you're looking at trouble down the road. But also because of who we are as a country, right? That we need to be responding to what is happening to humans on the ground as part of who we are. We claim that we stand for universal values. We cannot just divorce that and put up the wall that says, well, that's the government. So in Egypt, I'm trying to reconstruct. I think I would have been prepared to say it was a coup. I think we made a mistake there. I understand why at the time we thought we had more leverage over the military government, and we thought by not calling it a coup we would retain that. We don't. It's evident that we don't. I thought even then this is a difficult line to draw, but it's the right one to say, no, Morsi did a lot of stuff wrong, but a coup's a coup. And that was a coup, and honestly, we should not assume the military is our automatic strategic ally. We should have assumed that actually that was a bad government, but had it been voted out, it would have been better to have it voted out. So that's where I think I would have differed. And I think the old view of strategic interests said, don't call it a coup. My view of strategic interests would say, you can't let a government go massacre people in squares.
Yes, Jim.
Hi, Anne-Marie. Joe Eldridge.
I know well.
How are you?
Give my best love to your wife.
I will. I certainly will. My question is, how do you embed an ethic of care in the machinery and the bureaucracy of foreign policy decision-making?
It's a great question. You can appoint Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State and maybe other things. I think partly you start by legitimating talking about it, right? I mean, that really, I actually think there are lots of people who would like to be able to give more weight to the human side of a lot of these issues. I think the traditional way we were taught it was that was soft, That was, that's secondary. It's like development, security's up here, development's down there. So I think in part you widen the idea that, of course, the human side is every bit as important as the traditional power side. Then I do think, whom you appoint really does make a difference, and who's in power, and thinking about, appointing people who come out of the development community. And Maria is actually a wonderful example of Maria Otero, Joe's wife, who did a spectacular job as ultimately the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. And that's the third way. Originally that was democracy and global affairs. We changed that very deliberately in the QDDR to civilian security, democracy, and human rights. Underneath that undersecretary, we very deliberately put hard security and soft security together. So we put together INL, the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, a new Bureau on Conflict and Stabilization Operations, the new Counterterrorism Bureau, that's all hard security, together with populations, refugees, and migration, and democracy, human rights, and labor. That was an institutional, deliberate move to institutionalize human security, which we call civilian security, but together with more traditional counterterrorism or stabilization operations. So I think the combination of kind of changing the discourse, changing whom you appoint, but very deliberately, I wanted that job to be a job that somebody as talented as Maria would want, that somebody like Samantha Power would want, that people who really wanted to be players in Washington would say, I want that job. And then that way you get powerful people who have a portfolio that has institutionalized, if not an ethic of care at every turn, at least much more of one than, say, a standard regional bureau.
Maria was our last Dean's discussion guest. We had a great conversation with her about these issues. It's still on the SIS website if you missed the conversation. You had a question right here, yes? Okay. We have up front? No, because then people who are watching it can hear.
Hello, I'm Chris Jobin. I'm an SBA student. So kind of going off Egypt a little bit. So we kind of have this two dynamic, at least in my mind as an SBA student, so take me if I'm wrong, the kind of Cold War dynamic of just whoever's most pro-U.S., who's ever most pro our allies, kind of the old strategic interest versus who's the most popular, most newly democratic. Do we want to take kind of the 180 shift totally towards just whoever is the most pro, and then even if that, especially in nations where we've been heavily involved like Iraq, Afghanistan, and even to a somewhat smaller degree or to a much smaller degree in Egypt, how can we justify getting involved and then putting in a government that is not friendly to us?
So it's a very good question. I mean, you can never do all one or all the other, right? I mean, you really can't. And even a Kissinger who is supposedly only about, power calculations. Actually, if you read his book, you see there are places that he would say, no, in fact, you've got to go, with this particular government for different reasons. And people who are completely, who come in and say, it's all about democracy and values and human rights, make power calculations. So everybody does both. They have to. But again, this goes back to Joe's question, or how to think about it. So let's look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. So lots of people say, and I think this is right, the origins of what happened in Ukraine are the expansion of NATO. Now, I was part of that debate when we expanded NATO, and actually Charlie Kupchan ran a group at the Council on Foreign Relations on the expansion of NATO, and I think Kissinger and somebody else chaired it. I can no longer remember. But I was opposed to the expansion of NATO at that point for the same reason that everybody's giving now, which was you could foresee, and George Kennan wrote this, you are going to undo all the good work we're doing with Russia. You are going to reignite the Cold War in the sense that Russia is going to feel under threat, and you're going to pay for it down the road. And I totally, as somebody who had studied the Soviet Union in college, that's where I was. Richard Holbrooke came and made a presentation to us and talked about what it was like. At that point, he was on the front lines of, not of Dayton, I guess it was around Dayton, but had been in Bosnia. he'd been in Budapest and he'd seen maps of the greater Hungary that, were maps that went all the way into Romania. And he said, this is about the people of Central and of Eastern and Central Europe. This is about giving those people and their governments a tangible thing that shows that they are a member of the West, but more importantly, supports more moderate governments who can actually bring them into democracy and greater prosperity. And he changed my mind. I mean, it's really, I remember sort of thinking I had been all here. And today, that's the way I still think about it. So Tom Friedman comes out and says, well, I always thought the expansion of NATO was a terrible idea. Yes, on a calculation, a pure power calculation, it was a terrible idea. On a calculation that the reason I'm in foreign policy in the first place is to try to make the world, as Hillary Clinton would say, a world where every human being has an equal chance to flourish. I think, yes, I'm sorry that this is creating a geopolitical problem for us, but I'm quite certain that the expansion of NATO played a very important role in stabilizing Eastern and Central European countries, which was one of the great foreign policy triumphs of my lifetime, that a whole group of countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain made it out, are relatively prosperous, relatively democratic. Hungary's having its issues at the moment, but, and so that's exactly, you have to weigh those both. And I'm not saying I would always come down, because there are times where you have to sacrifice the people for a different, a principle, and you can't intervene everywhere, but that's a case where I know where I come out. And that's the kind of argument that is not generally legitimated in the way we talk about foreign policy.
Well, I think one of the biggest problems with respect to that debate is that the people who were opposed to NATO's enlargement have not given a convincing case for what the alternative would have looked like. I mean, if NATO had stayed frozen, the kind of insecurities that would have arisen in Central and Eastern Europe would have been tremendous. And people say, oh, well, the EU could have enlarged. The EU could only enlarge because NATO enlarged. NATO provided the security that the EU could then do the enlargement. The Baltics would never have been able to come into the EU if NATO hadn't provided that security. There was I do think that, in the 90s as this debate got going and you had the Clinton administration trying to reach out to Russia and reach out to Yeltsin and with Strobe Talbot leading the way on that, I do think that people felt that they could ultimately convince the Russians that this wasn't directed at them. And of course, that was not true.
Right.
They couldn't convince them. And there, of course, also was no ability to find a mechanism for the security of those countries that weren't going to come into NATO and that were between NATO and Russia. And, that's where we are.
And I think
today,
I remember, I don't, for posterity, I'm not absolutely certain, but I'm pretty sure it was Brzezinski who said, we should move the line as far as we possibly can so that when we're once again, at enmity with Russia, it's way, in other words, he thought exactly what the Russians were scared of. So that there was that strand of the debate too.
Right. I want to, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to come back actually in a different way to this issue of what's recently happened in Ukraine. On two dimensions. There's a lot of talk today that what Putin has done in sort of a naked land grab, having a military enable an annexation of a territory, is really a profound disruption for the international order that the United States has tried to foster. And so I would like your thoughts on both that as well as our old friend Tom Wright had a piece today that I saw on essentially the impetus to deglobalization, because you have a case of Russia acting, of sanctions being imposed, that countries watching this will think, gosh, you can't get too interdependent, you can't get too exposed because you leave yourself vulnerable to countries taking action against you. And your thoughts both on sort of what this particular case means for the longer term and in how we think about the international order, but also whether you think countries will watch the reaction to what Russia has done and think, got to reduce our vulnerabilities so that we can't be exposed to these kinds of sanctions.
That's a great way to end. So on the first, I have an op-ed about this in the Washington Post tomorrow, so you get a little preview here, in which I argue that yes, it was a land grab. The other way to look at it, though, would be to say it was an intervention and an occupation. I mean, would it be any better if Russia had simply, put in the troops and kind of kept the troops? It is different than Georgia in that sense. I mean, South Ossetia and Abkhazia were already, pulling apart from Georgia. On the other hand, Crimea does have an unusual history, right? Again, as somebody who grew up reading Russian novels, right, the Crimea was never part of Ukraine. It was part of Russia. It is an odd thing that Khrushchev handed it off. I mean, no one ever asked the Crimeans what they wanted. So, and more generally, I say this in the piece, our sanctimony about international law is almost just unbearable. I mean, oh my God, Russia violated the international law, and everybody in Europe, I was just there, is going, excuse us, Iraq, remember Iraq? And for that matter, although I strongly supported the intervention in Kosovo, it was illegal too, right? And so, and again, what Milosevic was doing in Kosovo is not anywhere comparable to what was happening in Crimea. But I think we're making a big mistake to say this is the end of an era. I think this whole idea that we say this is the end of an era and now we're in a new post-Cold War era where Russia is once again the lead adversary and we need to tighten up on NATO and arm the Ukrainians, that is just playing into Putin's hands. I mean, we are giving him the world he wants. It's the world where Russia is enormously important, far more important than it should be economically or even geopolitically. It is also strengthening him at home, right? Well, Putin is not in good shape at home. Yes, he has, suppressed Pussy Riot for now, and Navalny did not win, but the networks of civil society, they keep protesting, right? They're not being put down. His economy is weak. His energy levers are actually getting undermined. And yet we're handing him the United States is once again says Russia's enemy number one. So I think we should cool it on the new era and simply punish him for what it was. I also think, frankly, it's remarkable to me that he essentially took Crimea and let Ukraine go. I thought there was a very high chance he was going to invade and keep Yanukovych in power or send in troops and otherwise support Yanukovych. That's what the Soviet Union certainly would have done. So I think actually we have Ukraine signing an association agreement with the EU. It's without Crimea, but if we look at where we were a month ago, the West won. But now, we still got a long way to go to make sure the Ukrainian government is a good government and a stable one. The last point on deglobalization, I think the parallel is with the NSA and the internet, right? I mean, lots of countries are looking and saying, oh, being all interdependent, being all one internet, that means the Americans can look everywhere. And the same is true financially. If everything's interdependent, the Americans can say, we're not going to do business with any bank that does business with this person, and it really bites. I do think that's something that we have not thought enough about, and that certainly from the point of view of the tech companies, we are shooting ourselves in both feet with the fallout from the NSA, when we're really handing other countries a means of, the tech companies would say, protecting their own domestic technology industries. But more generally, you're risking, balkanization of the internet to some extent. And to the extent, then people start saying, well, I'd rather do business in London, but probably not London on this one, Singapore and Hong Kong would strike me as two real big winners from these sanctions. We do need to think through that, I think, a little better.
Well, we know from trying to schedule this how incredibly busy you are. So we are so grateful that you were able to come over to campus this afternoon. Thank everybody here for coming. Thank those who watched it on the live stream. Really appreciate it.
Great. That was wonderful.